Today we're talking about the financial disclosure process in England and Wales. Emily Helm is an English solicitor. She is Franco-English, but she practices law in England at MBS Family Law. And she's got over 15 years experience supporting people through divorce, financial arrangements, children arrangements, prenups, you name it. Because Emily speaks both French and English, and she deals with a lot of international cases. She has a lot of clients who are Franco-English. So, yeah, is there anything to add, Rachel, Emily, that I should have mentioned?
No, I think you've covered it all. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So, as I said, today we're talking about the financial disclosure process,
Yes.
which is not a particularly fun topic, but an important one.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people struggle with it.
Yes.
I've seen a lot of my clients panic at the 28-page form that lands in their inbox, but also it is quite a complex form and it is an official form. So it does, understandably make people nervous. So could we start with maybe just kind of some level setting?
Yeah.
What is this process all about? Why do we have to go through it?
Well, I guess, the process actually it's almost kind of like there are three different elements to it. So you've got the divorce side of things. Mm-hmm. And pulling the emotions to one side, because I understand it's obviously, hugely traumatic. It is, in the court's eyes, just administrative.
Yeah.
So that's just one aspect. Then the other aspect is children. So those people who have children, they need to think about what the arrangements are going to be. And then the third part, which can often be quite complicated, is the finances, mm-hmm. because when you've been together for a long time, or not even that long, you've created this sort of financial matrix between the two of you that needs to be untangled, so that you can both, go and live comfortably and, continue with the next chapter of your life. And so the financial disclosure process is really, it's about that. I guess the purpose of it is really to kind of allow both parties to understand what the assets are, what they're worth.
Yeah.
And the same applies to, liabilities. What are the liabilities? What are they worth?
Yeah.
If the parties are working, what income are they bringing in? If they're not working, do they have an earning capacity?
Yeah.
And the idea really is just to try and pull all of that information together, because once you have the information, it can take away a lot of uncertainty and hopefully open up the door to having a conversation to try and reach some kind of agreement.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So you're basically putting all the cards on the table. You need to have that information to negotiate something.
You do, because if you're not putting it all on the table, then people start not having trust, and in a situation where a relationship has broken down, trust has gone. And so actually, if people aren't then being open and honest with each other about the financial position, it just then sort of makes people feel, again, more sort of untrusting of what's being said, and then it's very easy for negotiations to fall apart. So I think pulling all your cards on the table is really important.
So at what stage of the process do you have to do this?
Well, I would say the sooner the better.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the sooner they engage with financial disclosure, the better. And that can partly be because actually it's quite time consuming. Mm-hmm. There's lots of information that you need to pull together. You might need to go to third parties to get some of that information, and that can take time. If the assets are complicated, if there's, for example, businesses or pensions, which are quite valuable, there might be a disagreement as to what they're worth. And so you might need to instruct an expert to come in and help with that process. And again, that takes time. If they're engaged in the court process, which often goes hand in hand with doing a Form E, then there is actually a court timetable. So they have to do a Form E. Normally, I think it's about 6 to 8 weeks after they've made the application.
Okay.
You can do it before then, but there's always a deadline otherwise.
Oh. And what's the logic then? Is it because you want to have all that information to be able to have a proper conversation?
Yeah, just because I think once you've got the information, then you can start negotiating. If you don't have the information, you're going to be sort of held back in terms of working out what's going to be a fair settlement in all of this. Yeah. So the sooner you get on with it. It's hard, don't get me wrong, and it can be really overwhelming, but you just have to start. It doesn't matter where you start, it's just a question of starting.
A lot of difficult things, actually.
Like a lot of difficult things. Exactly.
Exactly. So for those who haven't actually done their financial disclosure yet, what does the process entail in practice?
So the first stage would be to complete the Form E. And like you said, when it lands in the inbox of people, their hearts drop. They just look at it and they think, oh my God, where do I start? How do I do this? And I think actually it's just taking your time, doing it section by section, and just trying to work through it really methodically. So, and it's also something I would say to people, don't rush it, actually do it properly, because it can in some ways be the sort of financial DNA of your case. And so it's really important to really think about the information you're putting in it and making it as accurate as possible. So what you will do is you will complete this Form E, and then when you're both ready, you have to exchange Form Z. So if you've got solicitors, that would normally go through with your solicitors. And once you've exchanged Form Z, then you have a chance to raise questions.
Yeah.
So the questionnaire, it's called. And quite often people think, great, I can ask every question I've ever wanted to ask about whatever it might be. And that's not the purpose of the questionnaire. It's really aimed to try and work out what you might not know about an asset and its value. And what might be obvious to one person might not be obvious to another person. So it's an opportunity to ask questions, reasonable questions. And then after that, after you've done the questionnaire, normally about sort of 3 weeks later, you have the first hearing, which is known as a first appointment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so quite a thorough process. And actually, it's interesting because in France, it's a much more informal process. And it's actually not, not really enforced by the court or anything like that. So what would you say are the pros and cons of having it so formalized in England?
So I guess the advantages would be that you have a structure in place and a timetable. And I think at a time when everything is quite uncertain and quite unsettling, sometimes actually having a structure in place can help people because they know what they have to do. Some people need to have a deadline, think, right, I have to have this done by this date. And that can really help. The other pro of kind of having this formal structure is that if one party is maybe not giving all the information they should be giving, there is a process, the court can intervene, and that can be really helpful. Or if someone's dragging their feet and not really engaging in the process, the court can assist with that. And I guess, ultimately there is an end in sight, and that can also be helpful. Although litigation, and this I guess comes into the disadvantages, litigation is uncertain. It's like a game of
Russian roulette
or something like that. I mean, not quite as extreme as that, but you don't necessarily know what the outcome is going to be. There's a bracket, but you don't, depending on which judge, you can have two judges with the same set of facts who come to two different conclusions. And that takes the control away. I would also say that if you're in the court process, one of the disadvantages is that it becomes quite positional. So it can be quite adversarial in nature because you're constantly thinking about the strategy within the court proceedings, how you're presenting your position, and that doesn't always lend itself to people being able to negotiate openly and thinking perhaps about what's best for the family. And I guess the last disadvantage would be that it's expensive because there are documents to prepare, you have barristers to instruct for hearings, and that does cost money.
So does the financial disclosure happen only when there is a litigated divorce, or does it happen anyway, no matter how you're resolving your dispute?
So it can happen in different ways. So you don't have to do a Form E. You could just do like a simple asset schedule, setting everything out. If lawyers are involved, they're always going to want the supporting documentation because they like to know that it is what you say it is. You can, I remember some of the cases where in big money cases, for example, there might be a sort of kitchen table negotiation where the disclosure is written on the back of an envelope. And they say, look, I'll give you X. And the other person goes, great, fine. I don't care what there is. I'll just take that. And that's fine up to a point because you obviously need the judge to approve your agreement in a court order. And so at that stage, there has to be some formal disclosure because a court can't approve an agreement without knowing roughly, not necessarily the huge amounts of detail that a Form E would provide for, but it needs to know roughly what there is to make sure it's not leaving one party destitute. And so the simple form that you would have to do at that stage, it's got a great name. It's called a D81. Um, for me, DA21, it's yeah, good names. So yeah, that's like a real summarized
Okay.
form, which sets out what the assets, not what they are in detail, but just what the overall property values are, or pensions and liabilities.
So there's some flexibilities for those who don't want to go through the whole process.
Yeah, you can. You don't have to go down the formal Form E route. It's I think lawyers prefer it just because it's always good to have all of the information so that you can be better able to advise your clients. But sometimes, the way that people arrange their marriages is that they know exactly what there is and they've had a really open relationship. And so I've got a case like that at the moment where they don't want to go down the Form E route. They are asking certain questions and they're going to do an asset schedule, but they're both okay with that.
Yeah.
And so that's fine.
Okay. So for those who do the more formal process and use the Form E, what kind of information do they need to gather? You touched upon a tiny bit earlier, but is there a lot of work involved in gathering that information?
I mean, it depends on how many assets there are and what the assets, so every case will be different. But yes, so for example, for every bank account that you have, you need to have 12 months of bank statements.
Oh, yeah.
So,
okay.
That's quite a lot of paperwork. I mean, it's all online now, but that can take quite a bit of time to provide. If you've got savings, then you need to have an up-to-date statement showing what there is. If there are pensions, you need to know what the transfer value is and get paperwork to support that. With properties, in the beginning, we generally tell people to get an estate agent round and do a market appraisal. So there is a lot of information. I would say actually that one of the more time-consuming tasks is doing a budget, a schedule of expenditure. I don't know if you found this, working with your clients.
Yeah.
And actually, quite often they don't know where to start.
They don't know.
They have no idea, and it is. And I don't envy them. I think if someone said to me, do that, I would absolutely hate it. So I do understand that we ask a lot from our clients, but it's so important for them to have an idea of how much they're spending on a daily, monthly, annual basis, because it then leads on to the later questions in terms of what is it they need moving forward. And it's amazing actually how often that when clients go through that process, they then feel so much better once they understand it. They feel much more in control of the process.
They have all that information finally.
Exactly.
I think that's something that should be done anyway. I do it with all my clients, at the start of divorce. What's that budget for your post-divorce life? And you need to make sure that it all adds up. And that's what's going to allow you to see whether the proposals from the other person are viable or not.
Exactly. Because otherwise, how do you know? Exactly. How do you know if it's going to work? Yeah.
And so what happens if one of the two people doesn't even engage or lies or hides assets? How's that handled, and what kind of penalties are there to prevent this kind of behavior?
Yeah, so it does happen. I don't think it happens too often.
Good.
There's often a lot of suspicion. There's always, there are quite often people who think, oh, there's a pot of gold, so we need to find it. And you have to think really carefully about whether you do that, because that can also cost quite a lot of money.
Yes.
To go hunting for something.
How big is that pot? Is it
yeah, and it might not be there. There might not be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Yeah. We just don't know. But that's where being in the court process can be helpful. If there's a real fear that one party might not disclose, when you do a Form E and when you do this DAT1, there's a statement of truth that you have to sign. So the expectation is that you're being honest. If someone doesn't provide full and frank disclosure, then the court can draw adverse inferences. Yeah. And so that can lead to the court making an order that someone pays higher than they would do otherwise on the basis of those adverse inferences.
So you mean by adverse influences, you mean they're going to assume that there's more? Yeah. They're going to assume on the higher side rather than the lower side.
Yeah. But there obviously has to be enough information available to the court for them to make those adverse inferences. And quite often there isn't. So what the court might do is say, right, we're going to adjourn this hearing now. We'll put it for a later date, but you need to provide X, Y, and Z. And what they will do is they will put what we call a penal notice on the order, which basically says, if you don't provide this information, you'll be in contempt of court. And the consequences are you could go to prison. Now, obviously, people aren't sent on a daily basis to prison when they haven't disclosed information. Mostly because people do provide the information, but it has happened. There are reported cases of that happening. So, it only happens in the most serious of cases, but there is that possibility. What else is there? I guess if you can have litigation misconduct, so it could amount to litigation misconduct, and there could be cost orders made. So one party is made to pay the other person's costs. And in the most serious of cases, if you've reached an agreement which has been approved by the court, and you later find out that, well, actually that person lied or didn't disclose something which was quite material, you could then apply to court to set aside the original agreement.
Okay.
So
it's quite a formal process. I mean, in that sense, it's very official. If there's any kind of lying or misconduct, there are actual repercussions.
Yeah. So it's not recommended that you lie in your Form E. Is the sort of overall message to say is just just say what you have, because it's much better, and generally the truth always comes out.
That's true as well. You end up getting caught anyway.
Yeah, you do.
So one thing that I often hear from my clients is that things evolve, because, as you know, it's not quick to get divorced. And so they might do the for me at the start, but actually, I don't know, their property goes up in value or down in value, or one of them loses their job, or there's a million things that can happen within 6 months or a year, or even sometimes more. How do you handle that first of all, I guess if the divorce isn't finalized and the consent order isn't finalized, how, up until what point can you change the for me? And then I think you touched upon whether if there's changes after the divorce.
So there is an ongoing duty of disclosure. So if there is a material change to your circumstances, it wouldn't be necessary that you update the for me, but you would be expected to share that information. So, for example, if you get a job and you get a massive promotion, then you would be expected to disclose that information as and when it becomes known to you.
Is there a formal process for doing that?
I mean, usually what happens is you would just write to the other party to say this has happened. But normally before every single hearing, not the first appointment because you've just had Form Z, but before the second hearing, which is the negotiation hearing, and then before the final hearing, if you get to that stage, you have to provide updating disclosure. So there is a time and a mechanism for that to happen. But otherwise, as and when it becomes known, generally the expectation is that you would share that information.
Okay. Yeah, the other thing that I see a lot, and it's kind of related, is that there's, as we mentioned, that budget where you have to enter your expenses. And a lot of people, especially our clients who tend to be international and potentially relocate after the divorce, they don't necessarily know what their expenses are going to look like after the divorce. And one of the questions that I hear the most is, what do I do? Do I put what I'm spending today, or what I'll be spending, once I'm off? What would be the right advice on that?
I mean, generally both, actually.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think, you can have multiple budgets, and generally when we get clients to do it, we do ask them for what their current expenditure is on the basis of, what was the standard of living during the marriage, so we can get an idea of what they were spending when they were, together. And then on the future budget, it is hard, and I feel like I'm saying this all the time. I have got a case where someone is going to be relocating, and it can be a challenge trying to work out what the expenses are going to be. So, there are people actually out there who can provide that type of information available to you to give you an idea of what the general costs of living are in a different country. And it's always just trying to, make your best guess. You could put together a budget on the basis of what it would cost you living in the country where you are now. And then, try and factor in whether you're moving to another country which is more expensive or which is similar. And, having a look online in terms of what the kind of information there is that's available. And, you could even get an economist maybe to give an opinion on what it costs to live in a certain country. And, things like property particulars, you can always speak to estate agents in that country to kind of know what price, house prices are doing. And so I think it's not always straightforward. And sometimes at the beginning, when you really don't know, you can write TBC in your Form E. It's always better to provide as much information as you can, because that's going to aid settlement. But when you really don't know, and that happens sometimes when you don't actually even know what the financial pot is, if you haven't really been involved in the finances, you might not know what's available to you.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
So
how does that get handled?
Yeah, well, sometimes it is a question of, they just say, to TBC, and I will expand upon this once I've seen the other person's financial disclosure. And inevitably at that stage, you can then, provide a bit more information and think about what, you might want to spend on a house depending on what's available.
Yeah, because that must be a bit of a challenge for those who aren't at all involved in the financial, in the household finances.
Yeah.
They might just not have that information, and then they kind of have to go with what the other person's saying.
Yes. I mean, I have, written lots of Form Es where I say I am reliant upon X's disclosure to
Yeah,
be able to answer it, because they just, they've had another role within their marriage, and that's fine, and that's not a problem, and that's not anything that anyone should worry about, because
okay.
the information will come to light. There'll be the exchange of Form Z. There's the opportunity to raise questions, and then one way or another, we then get all of the information, and then can try and get a financial planner involved and say, okay, well, this is what they're thinking, what's that going to cost, how, what's realistic. And it's always good to kind of work as a team and get the right people involved, because actually it saves costs in the end, having the right
Yes.
people do the right
Well,
things.
especially when it comes to finances, if you're going to make agreements that are not well informed, that can be quite dangerous.
Really dangerous. Yes, not a good idea.
So what kind of support can people get, because it is a slightly intimidating process? Would it be with a solicitor? Are there other sources of support that are available?
Yes, well, I mean, there's your support that you give, which I would say is really invaluable when people go through divorce, because most people say that actually 5% of it is legal. The vast majority of it is emotional, and actually spending a right amount of time working through those emotions and understanding it, and just reconnecting with yourself, because quite often when you're in a marriage, you are part of something, and I think a lot of people lose their sense of
Yeah.
self, and therefore they can feel quite lost in terms of, well, what is the future? What does the future me look like? And what do I want to be doing? And where do I want to be? And so I think actually spending quite a bit of time sort of reconnecting with yourself and understanding that
Yeah.
makes a huge amount of difference. You can then be in a much better place to make decisions moving forward.
Yeah.
So I think having that kind of support is invaluable. And I think financial planners as well,
Mm-hmm.
getting them involved in an early stage, preferably once there's been disclosure, so they know what's available in the pot,
Yeah.
that they can really help in terms of planning, what that life would look like and how much it would cost.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think when you're going into negotiations, you kind of know what your bottom
Yeah.
line is, that you can't go beyond. And that's really empowering, having that
Yeah.
information.
It's a very important piece of information to have as well, so you're making the right decision.
It is, but it's amazing how many people don't necessarily
Yeah.
have that. So it's, they say it takes a village to, raise a family, but it can also take a village to, get to that next stage and work out all the different things you
It
need.
certainly takes a team. I think that's
Yeah.
very clear. So,
Yeah.
but I don't get involved with the Form E because it is a legal document. I will
Yes.
help my clients think about where they can get that information and deal with the overwhelm that comes from it.
Yeah.
I don't know if a financial advisor would help them, or if it would be specifically a solicitor who can help them to complete the form.
I mean, yes, a solicitor generally does complete the form, or
Okay.
sometimes clients might do as much of it as they can themselves, and then they, get the solicitor to finalize it. I think in terms of where a financial planner can be helpful is sometimes in the budgeting.
Uh-huh.
So doing that, schedule of expenditure, in terms of looking at the future costs and what they might need.
Yeah.
You can do it with a solicitor, but sometimes you can also do it with a financial advisor, and it can be a good stage to get them involved and help you thinking about those things.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So for those, I don't know, who the people are on the
I
call. I
know.
recognize a few names, but for those who are going through a divorce,
Yeah.
And are about to start the financial disclosure process, what would you recommend would be your top 3 tips to make sure that it goes smoothly?
I would say start early.
Mm-hmm.
So start collating all of the information that you need as early as possible, because I think that could just make your life so much easier. If
Yeah.
you're making a really clear list of everything you have, everything you might owe, that's really good. I think number 2 would be a bit like we were saying, think about what's important to you.
Mm-hmm.
Think about, where do you see yourself in 1 year? Where do you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years? And sometimes I think actually maybe write a letter to your future self
Yes,
can
some
be
people do
quite,
that. It's really effective.
yeah, and I think it can be quite helpful. So that would be tip number 2. And then I think tip number 3 is focus on what you can control, because it's a really unsettling process. There's lots of things that you can't control, and I think if you focus too much on that, it can just quickly spiral. So really focusing on what is within your control, can be really good at sort of helping ground people in the process.
Yeah. And then building on that, I think you were saying earlier that it's okay not to have all the data and all the information.
It's fine not to have all the data.
People feel like
exactly.
it's such a formal document, you know, it's quite intimidating. But it's actually okay if there's things you don't know.
Yeah.
And it, you know, there's opportunities also to ask questions from each other, etc. So it doesn't have to be that you have all the answers from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps a little bit with that fear when you open that email.
Yeah, I know. Don't fear it. It's like we said, just start. I guess that would be tip number 4. Just start.
Yes.
Just start somewhere.
Take the first step.
Just take the first step, and the rest.
People often know more than they realize as well. So they might say, I have no idea, but they actually do know how much they're spending on groceries, and they actually do know, you know, how much their house is worth and stuff like that. So start with the bits that you know how to complete, and then you'll work through the rest.
Yeah.
But I think getting advice in that context is really helpful because it takes away that sense of overwhelm and that sense of fear of potentially making a mistake or not saying the right thing or entering the right number on the form.
And I think that's it, is just making sure you've got someone. Getting some advice is really critical because you're not on your own in this process. And I think as soon as people realize they're not on their own and they don't have to shoulder that burden on their own, it makes a real difference.
Yeah. I think, I mean, it is definitely a thorough and sometimes difficult process for people to go through disclosure, but it's definitely one of the big advantages. And when I see people debating which jurisdiction to divorce in, it is often something that makes the balance tip towards the English side of things, because if there's a concern about matrimonial assets being hidden or not being, you know, seeable, visible, then people do like to have that security of knowing that there's a formal process for putting that all on paper.
Yeah, it's amazing how that does tend to be quite a driving factor for people, of just knowing that they can get that financial disclosure, that the court will be there to help them with that process. It makes a big difference.
The flip side of that is that it usually adds a bit to their legal expenses.
Or a lot. Yes,
it's a trade-off.
It is the trade-off. So and that's again where we come back to the point of, if you know what you want, then and what you need, that can really help as well in terms of working out how much you need to pursue and how much you need to spend. Going down that rabbit hole of trying to get all of that information.
The cost-benefit analysis. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Emily. I haven't seen any questions go through, but maybe we'll pause for a minute and give people who are listening a chance to pop some questions in the comments box. We'll be more than happy to answer them and take advantage. How often do you get a solicitor for free? If any of you have questions with regards to your situation or just generic questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can answer them now. Otherwise, you of course have both Emily and my social media handles, so you can reach out to us through Instagram, or you'll find us online, but don't hesitate to reach out to either of us if you think you need some support, if it is more around handling the amount of overwhelm and decision making that comes through divorce. It is on the coaching side of things, but of course for the legal matters, you know, Emily's a great solicitor to speak to, and she's got, as I said at the beginning, a wealth of experience. So don't hesitate. I'm not seeing any questions, so I think we will call it a day. That means I've asked all the right questions.
Amazing. Great.
Is there anything you wanted to add before we hang up?
No, I think we've covered it all. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me.
Have a great evening, and thank you everyone who joined. Take care.
Bye-bye.